Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Lee Glazer. I'm the director of the Lunder Institute for American Art at Colby College. And along with Emily Jacobson, Blythe McCarthy, and Carrie Roeder, co-curator of the exhibition Whistler in Watercolor. On view right upstairs in the Freer Gallery until October 6th, Whistler in Watercolor and the accompanying publication, shameless plug for our book, it's available in the museum shop in the Sackler. Whistler in Watercolor traces a period in the career of the expatriate American artist James McNeill Whistler that's never been fully represented, even here at the Freer Gallery, the repository of the world's largest, finest, and most comprehensive collection of his work anywhere in the world. Now, the watercolors, while charming and accessible, are also works that reward close, repeated looking. So I hope you'll come back and see the show many times. I also encourage you to check out the Freer Sackler website for upcoming programs, including a series of curator-led gallery talks, watercolor painting workshops, and on September 21st, a lecture and demonstration by artist Peter Ulrich and Lee Culver, who's actually here today, a Washington watercolor artist who is also a specialist in American art of the Gilded Age. And that's really going to be an amazing program because Peter will be painting on stage, his process being projected on the screen, while Lee talks about the work in progress. So that's September 21st here in the Meyer Auditorium. And I should just mention, as an aside, the Washington area is home to a great number of watercolor societies, and I think some of their members are in our audience today. Much of that work will be on view at the Mid-Atlantic Regional Watercolor Exhibition, June 9th through July 13th, and that's at the Black Rock Art Center in Germantown, Maryland. So hopefully many of you can go and visit that exhibition as well. Now, just a little bit of background about Whistler in Watercolor before I hand things over to our speakers. Whistler, born in 1834, learned watercolor technique as a boy, and he occasionally used it for preparatory studies in his early career. But when he moved to London in 1859, watercolor mostly disappeared from his artistic toolbox. And this was despite the preeminence of watercolor in the British art world and Whistler's desire for conventional success in that arena. He actually only seriously embraced the medium in the 1880s. This was a period when Whistler urgently needed to reinvent his career, having had a falling out with one of his major patrons, Frederick Leyland, over the Peacock Room in 1887, and a financially ruinous lawsuit with the critic John Ruskin the following year. So it was in this context, with his career at a low ebb, that he rediscovered watercolor, creating a prodigious number of works in the medium over the next decade. Displayed alongside similarly diminutive oil paintings and pastels in a series of carefully orchestrated solo exhibitions both in London and New York between 1884 and 1889, the watercolors, beautiful pictures that were dainty and portable, as the artist described them, the watercolors were intended to expand Whistler's market reach to include what he called rich Americans who come to Europe shopping for art. They were also a new way for Whistler to demonstrate certainly deeply held avant-garde principles regarding finish, verisimilitude, and the value of artistic labor. Whistler called the watercolors little games, seeming to sort of make light of them, but they were invested with tremendous ambition, both for immediate financial success and for a more enduring art historical legacy. Now, I can think of no group of scholars better positioned to expand our understanding of Whistler's watercolor work and its place in the history of art than today's illustrious panelists, and their impressive professional accomplishments are summarized in your program. Freer Sackler paper conservator Emily Jacobson will lead things off with a look at Whistler's materials and techniques. Robyn Asleson, a specialist in British art and curator at the Smithsonian's National Portrait Gallery, will examine Whistler's relationship to the Victorian art establishment. And Kathleen Foster, author of American Watercolor in the Age of Homer and Sargent, and senior curator and director of the Center for American Art at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, will consider Whistler in the context of his American contemporaries. Following their presentations, there'll be a conversation among the panelists, and then a little bit of time at the end for Q&A with all of you in the audience. So now I'd like to invite Emily Jacobson to the stage and ask that all of you join me in welcoming all three panelists with a round of applause.
Good afternoon, everyone. Let me just get myself in order here. All right, there's the pointer. So we're going to kind of begin at the beginning and just very quickly, what is watercolor? Watercolor paint is made with dry pigments. This dry pigment can come from an organic source, such as indigo from a plant, or cochineal from an insect, or from an inorganic source, like raw umber from the earth, or emerald green, a pigment synthesized from copper and arsenic. These powdery pigments are finely ground and at the same time mixed in a binder, and that's what's being done right down here. The binder is what holds the particles of pigment to the paper support. Gum arabic and gum tragacanth, both from plants, are the traditional binders used for watercolor. Honey and glycerin are sometimes added to help consistency, and a material called oxgall is added to help the pigment particles disperse evenly in the solution. Watercolor is one of the earliest forms of painting. Primitive man used pigments mixed with water to create cave paintings. During the Middle Ages, monks used watercolor to create illuminated manuscripts. And in the 15th and 16th centuries, Renaissance artists like Albrecht Dürer and Hans Boll painted in watercolor. In India and Persia, various white pigments were added to make a more opaque watercolor paint. Watercolor painting reached its pinnacle, though, in Britain in the 18th century. And I won't talk a lot about that because I think Robyn will be touching upon that a little, except to say that during this time period in this golden age of watercolor, professional societies started to form, allowing artists to share technical information and promoting the medium's status relative to oil painting in an increasingly competitive market for art. And this popularity and spread of watercolor during this golden age really corresponded with the evolution and advancements in the color making and paper making industries, which is what I'm going to talk about. So watercolor painters before the 18th century had to make the paints themselves, purchasing the paint and binder separately from apothecaries. In the 18th century, colormen came on the scene. They began inventing ways to supply paint with the binder and pigment already mixed together and ready to use. In 1781, colormen William and Thomas Reeves invented the moist watercolor cake, which was immediately soluble when touched with a wet brush and would have looked similar to these paints here in this box. In 1846, the colormen Winsor and Newton introduced colors packaged in metal tubes, like the one seen here in the top center. These important advances in the color-making industry helped to revolutionize the ease with which artists could work and their ability to paint outdoors, heralding the popularity of painting en plein air. Unfortunately, there were no regulations regarding consistency of color names, nor in preventing adulterants or fillers from being added to the paints. One colorman's sap green paint, for example, might include Italian pink, gamboge, and indigo, and that's shown in this recipe from a recipe book of the colorman Charles Roberson. While another colorman's sap green might have yellow lake and Prussian blue added instead, as I found in a Winsor and Newton recipe. Another innovation that influenced the rise of watercolor painting related to the paper available to artists. Before the 1750s, handmade paper was formed using a mold made of thinly spaced wires running in one direction and widely spaced wires in another, and this is the mold here in the upper left. Paper made on this type of mold is known as laid or laden chain paper. When you look at laid paper with transmitted light, that's light shining through the paper as seen in the bottom left, you'll see the impressions left by both the laid and the chain wires. These laid and chain wires could become visible then when the watercolor painter was painting on that type of paper. In the 1750s, papermaker James Whatman introduced wove papers. Wove paper is made with a mold that has a woven screen, as seen in the upper right, rather than the laid and chain wires. This woven mesh imparts a smoother surface to the paper. And within a decade of then, Whatman paper mills, followed by other paper makers, were making paper especially for watercolor that were treated with a coating to prevent washes from sinking into the fibers. This coating, known as sizing, was most commonly made with gelatin. The greater the amount of sizing, the more resistant the paper will be to damage from manipulation during painting, particularly while wet, which allowed the artist more time to work and make changes. And this was a vast improvement for watercolor painters. By the mid to late 19th century, when Whistler was painting, watercolor papers were manufactured with specific surface textures called rough, cold-pressed, and hot-pressed. Rough denotes a paper that had been air-dried after being formed, leaving a rough surface, and you can see this in the upper left. Cold-pressed, which was also sometimes called not, which means not hot-pressed, denotes a paper that's been repeatedly pressed between the paper-making felts during the drying process to sort of flatten and smooth the paper surface, and that sample's in the middle. And then finally, hot-pressed indicates a paper that had been rolled between heated metal plates or rollers to compress the paper fibers and give a very smooth surface. So watercolor paper, and actually watercolor paper today is still made with those surfaces for watercolor paper painting. Watercolor paint takes on a different appearance when brushed across these three surfaces, lying more smoothly on a hot-pressed paper and less evenly on a rough surface, as you can see in these three details that were actually taken from the Whistler works on view upstairs. Now, our study of Whistler's watercolors here included the 52 watercolors at the Freer. We used a number of different analytical methods to uncover previously unknown information, some of which I will share with you now. In addition to the Freer collection, we looked at another 81 watercolors from 19 museums around the United States and Europe, resulting in a significant body of information about Whistler's works. We began by looking at known Whistler watercolor materials. All the supplies that had remained in the artist's studio after his death were donated by Whistler's sister-in-law, Rosalind Burney Phillip, to the Hunterian Art Gallery in Glasgow. They include watercolors and gouache paints in tubes and bottles made by the colorman Dr. Schoenfeld and Company, a German paint manufacturer established in 1862, and two London-based colormen, Winsor and Newton, established in 1832, and James Newman, established in 1784. Additionally, two watercolor palettes, a mixing tray, and the lid of a wooden box all have remnants of mixed watercolors. So these are all the materials pictured here. New information about Whistler's purchases of watercolor supplies was uncovered in the sales records in the archives of colorman Charles Roberson and Company. This ledger book, shown at the left, shows that Whistler began making purchases from Roberson in January 1881. Whistler likely turned to Roberson because he had left numerous other London colormen with unpaid bills after his bankruptcy. So the ledger book contains really a wealth of information. Between 1881 and 1883, the beginning of Whistler's most prolific period painting watercolors, he purchased numerous supplies. For example, on October 11th, Whistler purchased camel hair brushes, sable brushes, a block of paper, a waterproof sketching bag, a japanned water bottle, and watercolor paints, all equipment essential for working outdoors. And this purchase was immediately before he went on a painting trip to the Channel Islands. The other records in the archives confirmed that Whistler was buying his watercolor paints in tubes, and the description of this 18-tube watercolor box from the ledger matches almost exactly the palette at the Hunterian. And this is the palette on the left, and this is actually a picture from the Roberson archives of the palette they were selling. Computed X-radiography was undertaken on the 52 Freer works to look for watermarks, which can be used to help identify papermakers. A watermark is made from a wire attached to that papermaking mold I showed you earlier. And during manufacture, the wet paper pulp settles more thinly in the area of that wire watermark, which appears then more translucent when you hold the paper up to transmitted light. So far we've identified 5 watermarks in our Whistler works. And it's interesting because in his early watercolors, those painted before the bankruptcy, Whistler was using papers not necessarily intended for work in watercolor, including laid papers. 3 out of the 5 watermarks appear in works painted during a trip with fellow artist Ernest Delanoy in the Rhineland in 1858. So the watermark on the left, the initials LL in a wreath, has been identified by a paper historian as that of a French stationer and was found in 2 different versions of the kitchen that we have. In the upper right, you can see a partial watermark that reads Blau, B-L-A-U-W, and that's found in papers made by 17th century Dutch papermaker Dirk and Cornelis Blau. However, it's unclear whether this is a Dutch paper because the watermark is known to have been copied by French papermakers throughout the 18th and 19th century. In the lower right, we also found what's called a blind stamp or embossing in paper that reads Frère. This blind stamp could have been from a number of French papermakers with Frère in their name, but has not yet been firmly linked to one specific papermaker. Changes in Whistler's choices of paper can be seen from the watermarks found in his papers in Venice and after. We found a J. Whatman Turkey Mill watermark, and I realize this is hard to see, but this actually says J. Whatman Turkey Mill on Venice Harbor on the left. And another partial Whatman watermark was found on Nocturne, Grand Canal, Amsterdam, seen on the right. After 1880, I would say about 80% of all of Whistler's watercolors were found to be on traditional wove watercolor papers. Whistler knew his watercolors would be more successful if he used papers specifically made for that purpose. And as I mentioned earlier, James Whatman, who was the inventor of wove paper, the paper from his mills was really at this point in time considered the finest watercolor paper available. So the Roberson Ledger book also includes the information that Whistler purchased at least 16 blocks of paper. A block is made with sheets of paper compressed and sealed around the edges, except for one unsealed section. And you can see that both in this drawing and in this example of a block in the Hunterian collection of Whistler's works. Once the top sheet was used, it could be separated by inserting a sharp tool into the opening, running it around the edges to cut the adhesive, and releasing the top sheet. And as I mentioned upstairs, for those of you who were there, blocks made it easier for watercolor artists to travel and paint outdoors. Whistler's use of blocks was confirmed by the presence of blue fiber along the edges of at least 23 of his works. And that's what you see in all of these pictures, which were taken from the Whistler watercolors in our collection. We also learned from the ledger that Whistler bought 7 hot-pressed blocks and 7 cold-pressed blocks, with 2 being unidentified. Although Whistler used the hot and cold pressed papers in equal numbers, 2 discernible trends became apparent. He used the cold-pressed blocks mainly for his seascapes and preferred the smooth, hot-pressed surface for a majority of his street scenes. There are at least 5 fabric-covered boards from 1888 that bear the stamp of colormen E. Marais and Fee. These boards are all the same size and have the maker's stamp on the verso. Although these boards were probably manufactured for oil painting with a pre-prepared ground layer in oil, Whistler experimented with these nonetheless, and he was always a bit of an experimenter. 11 watercolors were painted on Japanese paper, such as the image shown on the left. Whistler used Japanese papers for his etchings and was well aware that the surface could be soft, unsized, and not conducive to painting in watercolor, yet he experimented with them as well. Whistler had always favored rough brown papers for his pastel drawings, and this is one of his pastels, a study for the Morning Glories. And he produced at least 9 watercolors on this support, including blue and gold, the rose azalea on the right. Throughout the 19th century, discoveries of new colorants extended the palette available to artists. Yet with the exception of cobalt blue, which was a more modern pigment, Whistler's early watercolors relied primarily on well-established pigments. A variety of ochres, lamp and bone black, vermilion, indigo, and Prussian blue, as well as lead white, were the primary pigments used in the early Freer watercolors. Like the shift that took place with Whistler's choices of wove papers in the 1880s, a similar change occurred with his palette. This was confirmed using non-destructive analytical methods, including fluorescence and reflectance spectroscopy, which can identify the elements that make up the pigments. London Bridge, painted before September 1881, seen here on the left, was the last work painted using cobalt blue. Note in Blue and Opal Jersey on the right was painted using cerulean blue during a trip to the Channel Islands in November 1881, which occurred right after his purchase from Roberson in October 1881. We think Whistler, being economical after his bankruptcy, switched to cerulean blue because it's a cheaper pigment. London Bridge is also one of the latest works to include an underdrawing. A striking element of Whistler's technique after 1881 is that he no longer created a sketch after painting. With his new focus on watercolors in the 1880s, Whistler expanded his palette and used more of the newly available modern pigments. He added cadmium and lemon yellows, as well as emerald green to his palette. He continued to use Prussian blue and indigo, as well as the newly added cerulean blue. So very little has been written about Whistler's working techniques in watercolor painting. Whistler's followers, students, and acquaintances, all of whom wrote about their experiences with Whistler after his death, made little mention of his watercolors. A trove of Whistler correspondence survives, but answers few questions. The only information comes from Whistler's follower Mortimer Mempes, who wrote, quote, "In watercolors, Whistler always used Chinese white with every tone to give body to the pigment, just as in his oil colors he used ivory black." Whistler indeed added zinc white to his paints, and he did so in almost all watercolors after 1880. We know this because zinc white can give a yellow-colored fluorescence when exposed to ultraviolet light, as seen in these 2 images. And what these pictures show is that he alternated between sometimes using the zinc white in discrete areas, such as South End Sunset on the left, and you can see that from this yellow fluorescence only in the clouds. Alternatively, he would mix the zinc white into almost every pigment, such as in Pink Note, the novelette, which is this image on the right that glows yellow almost overall. Despite the addition of zinc white, which traditionally was always used to make watercolor a more opaque paint, less transparent, a majority of Whistler's watercolors actually appear quite transparent. So the terms gouache or opaque watercolor have implications that don't seem to fit with these works. Alternatively, calling them watercolors doesn't convey the fact that they incorporate zinc white. And this is sort of a question of terminology that is unanswered at this point, and I'd love to hear people's thoughts on what they think that correct terminology should be. While the watercolors appear quite simple and dashed off, many are actually reworked. One example is a change made to the skirt in the reclining figure of Millie Finch, which was revealed during examination using reflected infrared light. And this, the image right here is what's called a reflected infrared image, which can sort of see through the paint and reveal underdrawings and changes made below the top paint surface. And what you can see is that the paint was spread, the skirt was spread much wider, and then Whistler painted over it, making a change. Examination with a microscope can also reveal areas that have been reworked. Disturbed fibers in the paper indicating rubbing and wiping are seen in this detail of a face in Harmony in Violet and Amber. Another microscopic detail, this one from Chelsea Children, shows how Whistler blotted an area to remove color, creating a highlight. As artists transitioned from formulating their own paints to purchasing ready-made paints from the colormen in the 19th century, concern about the permanence of artist material was real. Watercolor painting manuals of the day gave information on the permanence of pigments and advice on recommended palettes, while manufacturers began to include information about their pigments in their catalogs. When he was once asked why he did not use the expensive and brilliant colors currently in vogue, Whistler responded that he didn't think they could be trusted to look the same over time, saying, quote, "The old masters used simple pigments which they ground themselves. I try to use what they used." Despite this lofty notion, Whistler in fact relied on readily accessible modern paints. A critic's review of Whistler's 1884 exhibition described this painting on the left, a note in green, as a girl just touched with vivid green. She stands in front of a blazing yellow background. Now you can only see traces of this bright yellow along the left edge, and you can't see this upstairs, only in this picture, where the frame actually protected that side edge from light, while the yellows in the rest of the painting have dulled. We've confirmed the presence of a strontium chromate yellow, which is usually called lemon yellow when you buy it, and this is known to display a color shift from light exposure. So a part of what our research is doing is helping us to understand and identify some of the visual changes that have taken place in these works over time. And finally, I want to end just with a picture of our book, and also to let you know that you should keep your eye out for Whistler in Watercolor Online, which is a resource that's going to be to debut in December 2019, and it's going to include all of our ultraviolet, infrared, and X-ray images, as well as detailed pictures taken through the microscope and pigment analysis findings. Thank you. And now I'd like to invite up and introduce Robyn Asleson. I don't know how I'm supposed to change that. There we go.
Okay, hello. That was fascinating. I'm so excited. So in 1884, James McNeill Whistler was already well known as a painter, who was also a groundbreaking etcher, who additionally worked in pastel and dabbled in dry point and lithography. But in 1884, he added yet another feather to his cap with a one-man exhibition featuring an extensive body of watercolors. Right out of the box, Whistler adopted a daringly innovative approach, his mature style seemingly developed overnight. On analysis, however, we can see that his work in other media over the past 2 decades had laid the groundwork for Whistler's very remarkable watercolors. Whistler's early work in the medium was striking but quite conventional, made in the tradition of tinted drawings that served as models for engraving. After an initial sketch in pencil, which would have looked something like this, he used watercolor to define areas of relative light and shade. The tinted drawing then provided the model for an etching, which was the real focus of Whistler's attention. In 1859, Whistler began to experiment with dry point, a type of intaglio engraving that produces fine lines edged by a subtle velvety burr. Whistler's exploration of this technique reflects his gravitation toward a softer, more simplified treatment of form, as in this ethereal image. Whistler focused his attention here on his model's delicate features, her shimmering hair, and her tightly encased bodice, while allowing the rest of her body to dissolve into an insubstantial, wispy lines. And this is an effect that he would later pursue in his watercolors. Shifting his focus from works on paper to oil paintings, Whistler in the late 1860s began several ambitious experimental paintings that never advanced beyond freely handled oil sketches such as this. Rather than destroy or paint over such works, as he so often did with other pieces, Whistler proudly displayed these sketches in his dining room. Their somewhat mysterious, unresolved quality clearly appealed to him, and their appearance of fresh spontaneity was a perennial source of inspiration for his later work, and especially his watercolors. Also during the late 1860s, Whistler began to experiment with a highly diluted paint medium, thinned with turpentine to create a very liquid, runny sauce. And this thin medium behaved somewhat like watercolor, dissolving brushstrokes and softening contours. In The Artist in His Studio, a painting begun in 1865, the gray ground of the canvas shows through the sheer layers of paint. In the drapery of the two models, for example, we can see the gray ground, but visible brush strokes work with that to create and articulate the folds and swags of the fabric. Whistler's minimalist, almost abstract treatment of form in this sketch anticipates the approach he later adopted in his watercolors. The radical reduction of detail stimulates our visual imagination to complete the picture. To intuit, for example, the missing handle from this floating Japanese fan, and the complex position of the artist's wrist and fingers, and his virtually transparent legs, all articulated with a bare minimum of brushstrokes. And this minimalist aesthetic that we really begin to see here, along with the subject of the models lounging informally in this rarefied atmosphere of the artist's studio, really trading on Whistler's cachet as this remarkable kind of genius in his very carefully orchestrated studio environment. All of these things would later become predominant themes in Whistler's watercolors. At this date, however, watercolor was barely on Whistler's radar. Among the few watercolors he produced in the 1860s, this sketch, which is related to The Artist in His Studio, indicates a surprising lack of interest in exploring the full potential of the medium. He's working with a very opaque gouache that has this dry, chalky, sort of fresco-like appearance, entirely lacking watercolor's distinctive transparency. And there you see another view. Whistler continued his experiments with highly diluted oil paint into the 1870s with his nocturnes. He created abstract nighttime riverscapes such as this by brushing a thin oil medium across the canvas in bold, sweeping strokes. The diffuse washes of blue and black pigment seep into the canvas and bleed into one another in a manner similar to watercolor, creating subtle shifts in tone that suggest rather than define form. Whistler also pursued the soft, washy appearance of watercolor through his experimentation with a form of lithography known as lithotint, in which images are created with a greasy ink wash rather than the standard solid lithographic crayon. Whereas a traditional lithograph resembles a drawing, lithotints resemble watercolor, exhibiting the soft atmospheric effects that you see here and here in this delicate, diaphanous figure and the wonderful watery effects in the background, especially on the right side. Whistler produced these lithotints in 1878, the fateful year of his libel case against the influential art critic John Ruskin. Like many others, Ruskin objected to what he saw as a lack of finish in Whistler's paintings, claiming that rather than invest the time and labor necessary to bring his work to completion, Whistler merely flung a pot of paint in the public's face. Whistler won the libel case, but the court costs, combined with his award of painting projects of the past 10 years, and his dispute with his patron Frederick Leyland over payment for the Peacock Room, resulted in bankruptcy. Bowed but not broken, Whistler left London for Venice, where he produced an extensive series of etchings that further explored the pared-down aesthetic, and Ruskin would have said the incompleteness, that Whistler had been cultivating in a variety of media. In etchings such as this panoramic view of a Venetian canal, Whistler concentrated detail near the horizon line, leaving large areas of the etching plate virtually untouched above and below. In those unetched areas of the plate, he wiped ink in such a way that when printed, yielded soft gradations of tone suggestive of the atmosphere of a darkening sky and reflective water. And then in this later state of the same etching, it shows how Whistler approximated the effect of watercolor wash by wiping brown ink on the etching plate to create a more dramatic aura of sort of radiating out from the horizon. Occasionally, Whistler brushed ink wash directly on a print to test out ideas for toning future etched impressions. Here he's used a brown wash to darken portions of the water and the arched doorway. And here's another impression, this one printed with plate tone, creating the wash effect. In light of these efforts to add wash effects to his etchings, it's not surprising that Whistler began to dabble in watercolor itself in Venice. This view of a canal resembles the panoramic scenes represented in many of his etchings, but it gains much from the addition of color. And you can see how the exposed areas of white paper support that are untouched by the blue and gray pigment create this impression of clouds and shimmering light on the water. Also while in Venice, Whistler made this watercolor of his mistress and frequent model, Maud Franklin, reclining in a hammock. Whistler's radical simplification of form here verges on abstraction, compelling the viewer's imaginative eye to merge the somewhat disconnected shapes, patterns, and colors. The purity and simplicity of watercolor made it a fitting medium for Whistler's pursuit of radical simplification. This particular watercolor was made for a friend rather than exhibition or sale, which certainly accounts for some of its informality, yet it seems significant that Whistler chose to preserve serendipitous effects, such as the bloom created by an errant droplet of water beneath the hammock, and the unblended dabs of brown that define Maud Franklin's profile, marks that others might consider accidents or blemishes, but that convey an intimate, impromptu quality that Whistler valued. His approach to watercolor had come a long way from the similar subject that I showed you earlier, in which opaque gouache created a chalky appearance, entirely lacking the fresh, fluid transparency of the later work. After returning to London in November 1880, Whistler sought to shore up his shaky finances by mounting 3 exhibitions of his Venetian etchings and pastels. He then spent several months rapidly producing enough additional work to fill a 4th exhibition, held in 1884 at Dowdeswell's Gallery in London, entitled Notes, Harmonies, Nocturnes. Along with small paintings and pastels, the exhibition featured the first extensive group of watercolors Whistler had ever exhibited. In anticipation of the usual complaints about lack of finish, Whistler staged a preemptive strike by prefacing the exhibition catalog with a set of assertions concerning the relationship of labor to finish in a work of art. Statements such as, a picture is finished when all trace of the means used to bring about the end has disappeared. To say of a picture that it shows great and earnest labor is to say that it is incomplete and unfit for view. Work alone will efface the footsteps of work. The work of the master suggests no effort and is finished from the beginning. These statements turned complaints about lack of finish on their head by arguing that visible signs of labor were actually defects, not strengths, because they interfered with the pleasurable impression of beauty created with spontaneity and ease. Whistler failed to convince everyone, but many critics praised his watercolors. Several admired their achievement of subtle atmospheric effects, such as, sorry, I'm not getting this to go forward. I'm having a technical difficulty. I'm not sure what happened. Should I try maybe this?
Is that working?
No. Where do I aim it?
I think it's the right left button. Which side are you on?
Let's see if I can get it to go there. Ah, here it is. Okay, thank you. In any case, they were praising these atmospheric effects, such as you see here, this vaporous stillness of an Amsterdam canal and the smoky atmosphere of Piccadilly. These examples highlight Whistler's skill in working wet into wet, that is, applying wet pigments to saturated paper in order to create a diffuse bleed effect, ideal for representing atmospheric conditions. Where more precision was required, Whistler manipulated his medium with great control. For example, preserving rectangular spaces for the windows, which he filled with warm brown pigment suggestive of glowing light. In addition to creating luminous nocturnes, Whistler exploited the special properties of watercolor to depict sparkling daylight scenes. In Pink Note, Shelling Peas, the central figure, rendered in cool pinks and grays, appears almost translucent from a distance, in contrast with the warm, earthy browns that frame her. And flashes of exposed white paper enhance the impression of shimmering light. This image also highlights the deliberate flatness that Whistler had been cultivating in his art since the late 1860s, largely out of admiration for Japanese prints. In his watercolors of the previous decade, such as The Kitchen, which I showed you before, Whistler created a dramatic sense of spatial recession through the converging diagonal lines of the composition. In later works, such as Pink Note, by contrast, he deliberately collapsed spatial depth by treating the planes as flat, rectilinear shapes and patterns. The diagonal line of the trellis overhead provides the merest hint of spatial recession. In another daylight scene, Violet and Amber, Whistler used the wet into wet technique to create the impression of a blinding flood of light pouring in from the window and across the floor, dissolving form and flattening space. Many of Whistler's watercolors evoke the behind-the-scenes ambiance of the artist's studio, recalling the mid-1860s oil sketch and gouache study that you saw earlier. Here, for example, we see two women absorbed in a private tete-a-tete over cups of tea, with the ghostly forms of stretched canvases at right and swags of fabric at left, identifying the space as a working studio. The unfinished appearance of the drawing creates an impression of speed and ephemerality, as if we are catching a glimpse of a fleeting moment that will soon end, perhaps when the women see the artist's presence and break off their intimate chat. Whistler retained the impression of a rapidly dashed off sketch by heavily working some areas and rendering others in less detail. Considerable effort went into creating the pleated skirt of the woman seated at left, for example. Whistler superimposed layer upon layer of pale pink, lavender, and gray of various degrees of transparency and opacity. And you can see in this oil painting about the same period in which Whistler represented a similar skirt, he really couldn't match the wonderful filmy, floating, diaphanous impression you get from the watercolor. In contrast to the heavily worked figure on the left, the companion figure on the right is almost entirely abstracted, merely blocked in with thin washes of flesh color, gray, and brown. Her gesture is difficult to read, and her face is entirely undefined. Whistler often glossed over women's facial features in order to redirect the viewer's attention to the overall arrangement of color and form, in which the female figure was intended just as one decorative element. In this picture, as in other watercolors, Whistler used a smudge of pale zinc white encrusted pigment to actually blot out the detailed facial features of the woman on the left, so that they become nearly as vague as her companions. In this way, Whistler left more to the viewer's imagination. A few critics complained that they could not get a good look at the women in Whistler's 1884 exhibition, either because the artist had literally effaced them, or because the drawings dissolved into a chaos of brushstrokes at close range. And I think the critics' fixation on the faces of Whistler's young women bears out his wisdom in taking them out of the equation, lest they steal attention from the composition as a whole. Whistler's watercolor Millie Finch again evokes the behind-the-scenes appeal of the artist's studio. Thanks to note in pink and purple, we can recognize the vaguely sketched forms in the background as stacked canvases and swags of fabric, though Whistler now treats them as purely abstract compositional elements. And he draws an even more pronounced distinction between the heavily worked figure on the left, whose dress is rendered in numerous layers of watercolor washes, with the radically simplified figure on the right. The figure remains an abstract armature of line and color that communicates an impression of a body without mimetically reproducing it. It's doubtful that Whistler would have left this figure in such an undetermined state had the watercolor been intended for public exhibition or sale, instead of for another artist, Walter Sickert, to whom Whistler gave it in 1884. Despite the repeated complaints about Whistler's lack of finish, he was clearly sensitive to the differing degrees of resolution appropriate for public exhibition in comparison with private consumption by a colleague who understood his aims and methods. I'd like to conclude with this depiction of Maud Franklin, shown ascending a staircase in Whistler's studio. It synthesizes several aspects of Whistler's work in watercolor: his apparent spontaneity in capturing fleeting moments, the uneven degree of finish that enhances the impression of transience, and the element of serendipity and unpredictability inherent in the watercolor medium itself. All of these characteristics fed into Whistler's ideal of artistic mastery and his public image as a showy performer. As he stated at the Ruskin trial, the speed with which he worked reflected superior expertise, the knowledge of a lifetime, as he called it. And so evidence of speed, rather than evidence of labor, was the quality he cultivated. This impromptu glimpse of studio life was not made for exhibition or sale. It was Whistler's gift to Maud Franklin. So here again, in a work intended as a private, personal gift, we can discern the footsteps of work that Whistler labored so hard to efface from his publicly exhibited pieces. Evidence of indecision and second thoughts are evident in the profile of Maud's hat and the position of her arm, above both of which we can clearly see the ghostly presence of other earlier hats and arms. These marks have the unintended consequence of suggesting a figure in motion, not just Maud's, but also Whistler's, as he labored with his brushes on the paper. Many more traces of Whistler's labor will be revealed through the exhibition here at the Freer, and also through all the technical evidence that has been gathered in connection with it. And I have to say that as much as I admire Whistler, the dazzling showman, I'm very much looking forward to becoming better acquainted with Whistler, the earnest worker. Thank you. Okay, Kathy, I'm going to try to get in. Need help. We need help. Help, Barry.
While Ari is doing the work, I want to say how excited I am by this exhibition. I think it's mentioned on the signage, but this has not happened in the lifetime of anybody in this room, and I have been waiting for this show. It is really fabulous to have all these watercolors out.
That didn't work.
Well, you're close, though. Down to that little guy for the exhibition. See what happens. Yeah. Nope.
Do it again.
Yeah, it's working. It's just that this looks different than that. Okay, we'll hope for the best. Okay, my job is to give you the bigger picture and to put Whistler as a player in a thing I'm going to call the American watercolor movement. It begins, the American watercolor movement, as I'm going to encapsulate for you, begins with the formation of the first watercolor society in the United States, the American Watercolor Society, in 1866, and their first exhibition in the winter of 67-68. What followed from that moment is an amazing expansion of interest in watercolor painting in the United States, really driven by this society and their exhibitions. It was not a collection of radical, progressive artists. It was actually a group of middle-of-the-road, mainstream painters, but a very liberal and welcoming group that managed to basically within 15 years involve just about everybody in the New York art world. So this phenomenon peaked in the early 1880s, exactly when Whistler starts painting watercolors with seriousness. So I don't think that's a coincidence, and that's what I'm going to talk about. The first big, I dare say, watershed was in 1873 when the Watercolor Society had a huge loan exhibition of British watercolors and then a very large display of American watercolors that seems to have been a huge shot in the arm to this young society, and a number of major talents decide to take up watercolor painting, including the two gentlemen on the screen here, Winslow Homer and Thomas Eakins. Both of them picked up watercolor in the summer of 1873, and both of them sent watercolors to the show in 1874 that included men or boys in boats on the water. These are two artists that do not know each other at all, and it was my discovery of this simultaneity actually that opened up this whole question of what is going on here, that suddenly people are interested in watercolor. It looks like, at first glance, the arrival of Impressionism, because of course this is just the same moment that Monet is painting Impression Sunrise, which actually looks a lot like the Homer. Painting outdoors, painting light and air, painting these leisure subjects, the idea of the sketch, especially in the Homer as an exhibition object, these are all the hallmarks of Impressionism. And so one of the subtexts here is, what is Impressionism in the United States, and when does it come? So maybe you look at these things and you think, hey, is this Impressionism coming to the United States, and is watercolor like the vanguard? Well, actually, what watercolor looks like, for the most part, is William Tross Richards. This is his version of Impression Sunrise from this very same moment, 1873. It is the same idea of light and air and space, but it's painted with this kind of minute and delicate application of watercolor that is coming from the English tradition. It's coming from John Ruskin, and I invite everybody to rush across the mall and see the Pre-Raphaelite exhibition at the National Gallery, which has a lot of William Tross Richards that explains this Pre-Raphaelite taste in American watercolor. It is not impressionistic. It is, in fact, really quite opposite in technique. Well, in this moment, Whistler is a kind of latent participant, and the first two papers have kind of given you that sense of where Whistler is in this moment. He is exactly like most of the members of the watercolor phenomenon, a person who's known watercolor all his life, learned it as a boy. He probably learned it, we know he learned it when he was in school in St. Petersburg. He probably had lessons at West Point, because every military officer would have known how to make watercolors. So he had this in his toolkit, but he wasn't particularly interested. And in fact, the other thing I would say about Whistler, I need to look into this, because I'm creating a list of artists whose mothers taught them to paint watercolor. And that list is led by Winslow Homer and John Sargent. Many of the artists of the watercolor movement had women at home who were painting watercolors. Well, the ladies actually come into play here in the next aspect of the watercolor movement that is part of this gigantic, it's a big complex of things that's happening at the same time. And that is the aesthetic movement, the arts and crafts movement. And the watercolor movement is in this mix here. And this is a moment when Whistler actually is participating and contributing and very much in the avant-garde. This is his picture of the Lange Leitzen on the right from 1864, a woman in Japanese and Chinese robe painting on Chinese porcelain, although I love the idea that she's actually painting on a Bayard vase, but in any event, just think about it for a minute. The idea here is that watercolor was in the thick of the revival of all the decorative arts. It was the tool that the designers used who were so engaged in this moment in the beautiful interior. And 1878, which is the moment that the book, The House Beautiful, was published, was a moment when the idea of artists designing wallpaper and fabric and costume and textiles and working in ceramics. And this is Winslow Homer painting on tiles in the upper right, and then the upper left. And below is a watercolor by Whistler of porcelain. In the 1870s, actually, one of his principal advocations in watercolor was a series of illustrations of ceramics. So he's deeply involved in this crossroads in which watercolor is the design medium and this idea of the beautiful interior. And I'm showing you the view of the watercolor exhibition of 1882 with its Japanese parasols hanging from the ceiling, with fans tucked behind the paintings, and with lots and lots of Asian art scattered in the galleries in order to create this beautiful effect. So that complex of decorative arts is something that Whistler is very attentive to, and that so are the watercolor artists. Well, up until this point, these are all British, the influences. That is the Pre-Raphaelite detail, the Ruskinian watercolor style, and the aesthetic movement, which is something really coming out of Morris and the second wave of Pre-Raphaelitism. Things get a jolt in the middle of the 70s from a new style that is coming from a new style center. And it's not Paris. It is not Impressionist. It is from Italy and Spain. And the lead talent in this was Mariano Fortuny, whose work you see there on the left, his Arab leaning up against the wall. What was characteristic of the Spanish-Italian watercolor school, and Fortuny especially, he's Spanish and then he comes and works in Rome, is picturesque characters, people in costume, and you see Sargent and Akins picking up this same flavor, and then a dramatic contrast between a wild and brushy and wet background and a very finely painted figure with crisp detail, bright color, but often painted in a suggestive, a virtuoso fashion. So contrast of technique and the exotic subject matter. Fortuny is all the rage in Paris in the 1860s. I don't really know whether Whistler knew much about Fortuny. He must have looked at him because he was so much in the public eye, a very, very popular figure. He dies in 1874, and that creates a storm of publicity over his early death. So I'm telling you, I'm thinking Whistler knew about Fortuny. Certainly by the late 70s, Sargent, who is in Venice at the same time as Whistler, this is the prevailing watercolor style in Italy, and Sargent is gathering this in. Akins, off there in Pennsylvania, he actually was in Paris in the 1860s, knew Fortuny's work very well, and is gathering it into his more realist approach. The second shock to the system comes also from another corner, and that is from Holland. And this is, again, not from Paris. It is arriving in the late 70s from what is called the Hague School. I'm showing you the work of Jacob Maris here on the left, one of the leaders of this school, Maris, Anton Mauve. These are the names, very well known. Their work is being imported into the United States. It's basically Dutch Barbizon. It is low in color, that is olives and browns and grays, and it's very wet. The paper is soaked before you work on it, so the color runs and blurs, and so you get this sense of atmosphere and spontaneity from the Dutch school. In the United States, one of the advocates or one of the people who responds to this kind of work, I think kind of on his own track, is George Inness, who is a friend of all the watercolor artists in New York, and his work here from around 1880 is in this basically Dutch Barbizon style. I would say, again, not French. The French are not particularly interested in watercolor at this time. It's coming from other places. Well, the genteel, basically melancholy Dutch style is overcome by a wave of far more radical, wet, spontaneous watercolor painting that comes from Munich around 1879, carried on the work of this one artist, J.F. Currier. Frank Currier is a Boston artist who moves to Munich in the 1870s. He becomes the center of an American community that includes William Merritt Chase, Frank Duveneck, John Twachtman, and a bunch of other American artists, many of them from Cincinnati. He stays in Germany, but his friends bring his work back to the United States. Chase, in particular, owned Currier's work and lent it to the watercolor exhibition. This work, as I'm showing it here, appears in the watercolor exhibition of 1879 like an atom bomb. It was a catastrophic, explosive, critical event because the art world divided completely over. This is really the moment that the avant-garde becomes a thing in New York City. It's over what you think about Frank Currier, because this work was decried by the critics on the conservative side as being basically the end of the world as we know it. I mean, they thought it was ugly and that it had no art in it at all. The artists, however, loved the expressiveness of this. I mean, this was action painting, basically. It's very fast, it's very splashy and spontaneous. Again, like the Dutch Barbizon, wet and low in color, although occasionally with strong, pure color. Currier literally squeezed paint out of the tube along the horizon there in the sunset, pure red coming from his tube. That kind of intensity just astonished people, and this is what the New York Times meant when they said in 1879, the Impressionists are here from Rome and Munich. This was American Impressionism in 1879. It looked like Frank Currier. Well, the result, the impact of this can be seen immediately in Winslow Homer. He goes to Gloucester the following summer and paints sailboats here on the 4th of July, soaking the paper in advance. Again, very low color, that is low darks. This is basically a nocturne that is running and bleeding, and with, again, very limited palette, using just a few colors. And suddenly, who shows up? Whistler. This is Whistler in Amsterdam in 1882. Now, I would say for the first time in Whistler's life, he's actually a step behind. He's not in the lead. He is picking up basically this Dutch wet style, and of course, when he goes to Amsterdam, that's what he does. He's in Holland, he does as the Dutch do, and does this wet style, which has become, I think, is making waves in the general international watercolor world. He, however, is actually already entered the mix in a way, partly through his interest in decorative design and through prints, as the points that have been made in the earlier papers. Americans, in fact, the Watercolor Society showed his etchings in the middle of the 1870s, so people knew his prints pretty well, but they certainly hadn't seen his watercolors. This is when we get to the moment of Venice and what has been mentioned now several times, the Ruskin trial, the bankruptcy, the 14 months in Venice. Well, who is in Venice? You've already met Sargent. Sargent's in Venice at the end of this moment, but also a whole bunch of these Munich students of Duveneck. They were called Duveneck's boys. They were living in the same pension with Whistler. They were all having dinner together, and the Americans are all watercolor fanatics. The person who is the most impressed by Whistler, but who is basically a watercolor artist at this moment and a printmaker, is Robert Blum. And Blum comes back to the United States with watercolors that look like these, shows them at the Watercolor Society, and is immediately declared an Impressionist. So he's an Impressionist who comes from actually both Munich and Rome, and consolidates this style that is developing that we are calling Impressionism. The critics actually looked at these and said, these are Whistler's etchings colored. And they didn't necessarily disparage him for that, but they recognized that there was Whistler's print lying behind this, and I think actually also Whistler's pastels. Because when Whistler was in Venice, as we've been told, he only made a couple of watercolors, and I actually sort of think it might have been the Americans who were encouraging him to try watercolor a bit. Mostly, he was on a binge making etchings and pastels, and I think it's actually two-way street here in that Blum's watercolors are also taking up the qualities of Whistler's pastels in these watercolors. They are, in fact, a kind of a crossover between watercolor and pastel that we're going to see increasing in the 1880s. Well, Whistler then gets serious when he gets back to London, as we just found. He starts buying watercolor materials seriously only a couple of weeks after he gets back to London, and begins making watercolors in 1881, goes to Amsterdam and paints these nocturnes in 1882. And here is Amsterdam in Winter from 1882. I'm here to correct a mistake in my book that I have now. One of my tragedies is that this watercolor exhibition is happening after my book, because I would have been so much smarter if I had had it. This watercolor I published in my book, this Amsterdam view, as being possibly a watercolor that was shown in New York in 1883. Now the wisdom of the catalog has shown that actually it was a different watercolor, not this one. But the point is, a few watercolors were starting to trickle into New York by 1883, and watercolor in this particular style. And then, as has been noted, he takes up watercolor with great seriousness, with great energy in '82, has a big exhibition in '84 that includes work like this one here from the Freer on the right. And that material begins to be shown in New York, leading up to this major exhibition in 1889 at the Wunderlich Gallery that was a huge display and tremendously influential. What do we see in Whistler's style? The low color, the wetness, the simplicity, the reduction of detail, all of the points that we've heard in the first two papers. Well, the impact of this comes in many different ways. One possible person responding here is John Lafarge. Lafarge is also very early out of the box on the subject of Japanese art. He married the daughter of Admiral Perry, okay? He had lacquer and Japanese prints in his house in the 1860s, and so he was very early into Japan and to the decorative arts movement and into watercolor on his own without ever interacting with Whistler. But finally, when he gets to go to Japan, he paints something that looks like this of Kyoto in the fog that is very Whistlerian, and it may be just a question of like great minds traveling on similar tracks. Certainly Lafarge is one of the most important tastemakers in the United States at this period. And he would bring this watercolor back and exhibit it as a finished exhibition piece, which is another theme that we've heard today. The idea that a sketch is something you can frame up and put on the wall in an exhibition is a theme of the Impressionist movement. Well, where is the mainstream of the watercolor movement going? Is Whistler like driving this? Probably not. This is what's actually happening to the center of the watercolor movement. The paintings are getting big, elaborate. This is Winslow Homer, 18 months after he painted that sailboat picture with the skyrockets. He goes to England for a year and a half and remakes himself completely and comes back a mainstream English watercolor painter making these big, very finished, heroic, monumental, epic watercolors. At the same time, his friend, Edwin Austin Abbey, these are the two great stars of the middle of the 1880s. Abbey is mostly working in London by this time, and indeed he lives next door to Whistler and becomes a great friend of Whistler's, especially after his marriage to Beatrice Godwin. Abbey is a great pal. You know, that's not what you'd expect, that these two artists would be great friends, but Abbey, his historical imagination, his fabulous detail. This is a watercolor that it's not quite as big as the thing on the screen, but it is big and very detailed. So there's a different note in American watercolor painting that is proceeding. It's not like there's a linear path where everybody suddenly starts getting more impressionistic. However, certain avant-garde continues to get interested in Impressionism as we might know it, that is, from Giverny. Impressionism from Monet finally arrives in the middle of the 1880s. There's a big exhibition in 1886 at Durand-Ruel showing watercolors, showing Monet, Renoir, and the rest. And American painters begin to go to France, study French Impressionism, and they begin to look a few like Childe Hassam, his fabulous Island Garden from 1892, which is a textbook essay in Impressionism. Primary colors, painted very quickly, lots of white ground, sense of air and motion, of the flowers bobbing in the wind. This is a classic Impressionist painting. However, we're also seeing what might be described as a post-Impressionist movement in watercolor with Prendergast, who I think probably did look hard at Whistler at that 1889 exhibition, because the climbing composition here, we're in Venice again, so that's a sort of Whistler atmosphere, but nonetheless, the idea of the vertical mounting, the flatness of the composition, these clear little squares of color like we see in Whistler's street scenes, I think there may be some interchange here showing a different side of Whistler impacting American Impressionism or American watercolor painting. The 1890s, these are actually the glory days of Homer and Sargent, and so this is just to remind you of what's going on here in the mainstream. This is the side of Impressionism that comes from naturalism and realism, sitting outdoors, plein air painting, looking those alligators in the jaw. That kind of direct confrontation. This is plein air painting for sure. It's very colorful, it's very expressive. These two men are the kings of watercolor by around 1900 or 1910. And it's not particularly Whistlerian. But there's a whole other camp of American watercolor painters that look like this. And so the Whistler side is generally smaller, and the watercolors that you see upstairs are generally little sketchbook-sized pages. They are often have this quality of intimacy to them as opposed to the kind of grandeur and energy that you find in Homer and Sargent. Often very close valued, almost monochromatic sometimes, very low in color, not necessarily bright like Hassam and Prendergast, and with a quietness, and sometimes a very powerful sense of pensiveness and of melancholy. This is a style that we call tonalism in American art. It's growing out of the Barbizon school. By this time in the 90s, Winslow Homer and George Inness are the two most famous American painters in landscape. And so Homer is going in one direction. Inness is carrying with him a whole following in what is called tonalism. These two slides show the Giverny side of the story with Theodore Robinson, who worked in France, but who is painting in this soft Whistlerian style and little bitty things, contemplative things, things that, and this might even be a moonlight subject, things that I think are probably done from memory and in the studio. And there are a number of artists who work in this tradition, sometimes outdoors, but generally close valued and small. John Twachtman, another one of the Duveneck boys who was in Venice. Alden Weir, who had been following Whistler along from the 1880 forward. And then the tonalist side, that is the people who were following this sort of Barbizon tradition, Alexander Wyatt, Henry Ranger, this is Bruce Crane, Herman Dudley Murphy. These are like Bruce Crane's snow scene, sometimes a little lonely, this sort of sense of desolation, and in Crane's situation, big exhibition pieces, and quite finished, even as broadly painted as they are. I think most of these are from memory. They are not, again, plein air necessarily, but what you see that's Whistler in them is these simple formats and the emptiness of them, the airiness of them, the moodiness of them, that I think also borrowing from a note in Whistler. So ending here with around 1900, what you see is a creation of a style that is partly Barbizon, that is the Inness side of the story, plus Whistler equals tonalism. I mean, I've created a formula for you. And also a sense of a crossover of media that we have seen in the earlier papers, this idea of watercolor creating something of effect of a pastel, and pastels, people mixing watercolor and pastel and charcoal and other kinds of unorthodox things, which Whistler was fond of. This kind of, this mood and this sort of technical exploration are, I think, the legacy of Whistler and watercolor. And with that, we're going to bring some chairs up to the stage and have some conversation. Take it away. I'm going to just stick this back down.
Testing.
Well, I'd like to thank all three speakers for giving an amazingly comprehensive overview of, please, Whistler's work in watercolor. And I'm going to just get us started with a couple of broad questions, and then we'll turn it over to you in the audience, because I'm sure you'd like to partake of their expertise as well. And Emily, we'll just pass back and forth. Okay. Couple of things come to mind here. I mean, in my opening remarks, I mentioned that one of the things that was sort of driving Whistler when he took up watercolor in the 1880s, it was this kind of duality. On the one hand, a desire to create a legacy. He often talked about how it was the artist's business to carry on tradition, but he was also driven by a desire to make money. And so it would be really interesting to hear a little bit more just about the state of the respective art markets in both the United States and in Britain, and why the state of that market sort of drew Whistler to watercolor.
Is this on? Oh, good. So in England, there was a Royal Academy, which kind of was the highest level of art exhibition space, and mostly oil paintings. Watercolor artists were not allowed there for a long time, and so watercolor societies were formed to give them a venue and to give them a market. And there was always an interest in England because everybody learned to sketch in watercolor, and people often say the way to understand and appreciate watercolor is to try to do it yourself, because it's easy to take up but very hard to master. And so there was always this appreciation in England for the watercolor sketch. And it began to be exhibited. It became a kind of, very sort of almost elitist market for it, but very much in demand. And so I think that these exhibition spaces, the interest in them, all of this was showing Whistler that this was a market that he could get into and profit from.
But at the same time, did he participate in any of these organized watercolor societies, or did he seek to kind of distinguish himself from them in a certain way?
Yeah, no, he was always his own man, and he wouldn't exhibit with them because he had to determine every single detail of the exhibition. If he'd shown his watercolors in with all the others, it would have been blown off the wall because they're very small, they're very, had just often a limited palette, and so he had to create the ideal conditions for seeing them. But that added to their cachet, I think. People, it was just like his, so many images of his studio. There's a sort of mystery around Whistler, and he often opened up his door for people to come and see what he was working on. But I think he never thought he was going to become a popular artist, but he very much wanted to appeal to a kind of elite, progressive patron.
In the United States, the whole watercolor movement was totally driven by these market forces. And the Watercolor Society in New York was very straightforward about their marketing. They were trying to get people to buy watercolors. And then as that happened, and generally because watercolors were less expensive than oils, as that started to happen, that created a snowball. That is, as artists started to sell their watercolors, and Homer, for example, when he sent those little boys in the rowboats that I showed you from 1873, his very first trial at the Watercolor Society, he sold a bunch of them. So you better believe that the next year he was back with more because he was selling them, okay? So this was happening in New York, that they were finding a middle-class collecting audience that previously had not been able to afford the art market. I mean, even a small oil painting might cost several $100s, but you could buy, and don't you wish you had a time machine, you could buy that little boy in the rowboat for $50 at the watercolor exhibition, okay? So people were buying watercolors. That, as I said, created a sort of crescendo of interest as more and more artists began to pile into the watercolor exhibition. And if you can recollect that slide that I showed you of the little boys coming up the stairs with the Japanese parasol over the skylight and the potted palms and so forth, to show you the elaborateness of the installation strategy at the Watercolor Society. In that very article, which was called John Angelo at the Watercolor Society, it was about two little boys that go to the watercolor exhibition. and what they found. And one little boy turns to another little boy in the text and says, "Hooray for watercolors at prices everyday folks can afford." I mean, it was just so clear that this was meant to be reaching a new collecting audience. And so that's why, although I have zero evidence to this, I feel like Whistler's spending a year in the company of the men who had just come from New York and were all busy making watercolors in Venice. They must have said at dinner table conversation, watercolors are selling. They're selling big in New York. It's a phenomenon. I know very little about the London market, but I do know that in 1885, the Royal Institute of Painters and Watercolors, one of the two big old, 70-year-old clubs in London, opened a new building, a beautiful new building, with a lot of accompanying hoopla. And so I think there was a concurrent surging of interest in watercolor in London at the same time. It was not just something happening in New York, but they were feeding each other because there was so much, transatlantic communication. So the two markets, I think, were both booming.
Right, I think that's right, and it also certainly feeds into this notion of Whistler as a cosmopolitan artist who can't be contained by any kind of national boundaries or expectations, and begins to really see himself operating on a much larger stage, both in terms of marketing and kind of the art historical traditions that maybe not that he sees himself joining, but that he sees himself founding for the future.
To your point about yellow and white.
Right.
Can I just add one point about that? I think also Whistler before, I mentioned in my talk, he had been doing these big paintings that took a lot of time and he had a lot of trouble completing them, and he had very few patrons who could afford the price for that kind of work. And it left him vulnerable when he fell out with Leyland, for example. That was a big source of money gone. And I think he was trying to spread out his market by making smaller, more affordable works and creating a larger.
Right, and I mean, there is that great letter that he writes to George Lucas, who was this American art dealer living in Paris. He writes Lucas a letter in 1884 saying, "Please send the rich Americans who've come here to buy art to see my new exhibition. There's plenty for sale, dainty and most portable, so suitable for these travelers to stick into their trunks and so forth and take with them." Now, to your point about the rapidity and the seeming lack of finish, Emily, it would be interesting to hear from you about how Whistler's technique sort of corresponds to other renowned watercolorists, whether in Britain or in the United States. And I'm thinking particularly of his peers who became canonical artists in the history of American art, like Sargent and Homer. And I'm thinking about kind of the avant-garde, very startlingly modern look of Whistler's paintings and how that connects with his technique compared to Homer and Sargent's.
Well, I mean, really one of the biggest differences is that both Homer and Sargent were using underdrawing, so kind of creating a sketch first and to help form the composition of their paintings. And Whistler in the 1880s really stopped using an underdrawing, and it's a really big difference. So that there was that, and then what's interesting is, in some ways, for as innovative as Whistler was, his painting style in comparison to Homer and Sargent was actually much less experimental. So while Homer and Sargent were using masking materials in their watercolor paintings and doing a lot of scraping and scratching. I mean, Whistler was doing some sanding and blotting, but he wasn't being nearly as experimental as the Americans were. So it's an interesting dichotomy of he was certainly getting away from tradition by not doing underdrawing, and yet the painting technique itself was slightly more traditional. So I don't quite know where that puts him, but...
Well, I think it does. The perpetual problem with Whistler is where to place him. Is he British or is he American? Is he carrying on tradition or is he founding a more avant-garde? Is he a gateway to modernism? And just before I turn it over to the audience, just to sort of conclude with a major retrospective of American watercolor that took place at the Brooklyn Museum in 1921, the sort of heroes of American watercolor retrospective, and the great heroes of that, seen as sort of ushering in the modern era, were Homer and John Marin. And they were praised for their vigor and spontaneity and sort of inherent Americanness. And Whistler was really talked about just as a foil and was seen as something of a vestige of the previous generation, and it was very gendered language that the critics used. It was seen as more feminine. And so despite the fact that in some ways John Marin was very influenced by Whistler in both his etching and his painting, and certainly that kind of abstract formal quality that Whistler deploys, he's kind of effectively written out of the history of American art, at least as a founder of modernism. And so in many ways, I think he got his wish, which was to be a master without followers, kind of elevated but also eccentric, kind of outside of the mainstream. But it does make it difficult to know how to talk about him, and that's why it's so good to hear how he fits in reality into this broader framework, both in America and Britain. So questions from the audience. I think Ari here is going to run around and use the microphone. We are being recorded, so if you could talk into the mic, that would be super helpful.
Hi, do you hear me? Yes. Do you want me to stand up or just sit? Hi, my name is Monica Dorhai, and I'm senior fellow. I serve also with the archives, American Archives of Art, and Smithsonian libraries. I'm on developmental assignment. I work as a banker. And my question and a follow-up. My question, with this presentation, will we have any transcripts? Yes or no? And a follow-up, I'm a huge supporter of Whistler, and I've been for a long, long time coming to Whistler talks. I'm a huge supporter. Thank you.
I can quickly answer the first question, which is that won't be transcribed, but we are video recording it. So we'll put the video online probably by tomorrow, so you can revisit this conversation on YouTube or on our website whenever you'd like.
And the other thing to keep in mind too is that we have a publication, Whistler in Watercolor, Lovely Little Games, being sold through Yale and in our bookshop, and that includes a lot more information than we've been able to give, either in the tour upstairs or talk about today, particularly in terms of a lot of the research and analysis. So that can be found in the book.
Remember the women. I'm curious, Kathleen, about the mother's role in teaching watercolor, and did Whistler's mother teach him watercolor?
I don't know. I'm just asking that question to myself as we were listening. I was listening to his background. Maybe Lee knows the answer to that.
I don't think so, but I guess I haven't sifted through a huge amount of her letters are held at the New York Public Library. And I have to admit, I haven't gone and read all of those. But in ones that I've read a lot of the Whistler correspondence, and so far there's been nothing talking about his mother teaching him. I mean, he definitely learned from painters in St. Petersburg, and he was actually also taught by the older Weir at West Point, Robert Weir, right. So, yes, I don't
I'm waiting to
so.
take the Whistler's mother and make it into a meme that has her holding a watercolor in her hand.
Well, it's a curious list. I hope you'll continue and let us know.
Well, for Homer's mother actually exhibited her watercolors before he did. So I think she was egging him on. Yeah.
Whether or not she had anything to do with his artistic education, and it's true, in all of my reading of both his correspondence and his mother's, there's no evidence of that. she very early on took on the marketing of his work and began to promote it to her friends and colleagues in America, even before Whistler himself envisioned, a transatlantic market for his art. She actually died shortly before he began his surge of watercolor painting in 1882, 83. So she didn't live to see that become a significant part of his oeuvre, but was very invested in his career and his financial success.
And it's interesting because she does also make a comment early on in Whistler's career about how she had gone to a watercolor show and how she said, "Oh, Jemmy, I went to see works from your favorite media." And I'm sorry? Oh, and they were Turners. Oh, yes, that's right. It was an exhibition of Turner watercolors. She said, "I went to go see your favorite, style of art." So she knew early on that Whistler, loved watercolor painting, which makes it to me even more interesting that he didn't take it up again until way later, because it was something that he apparently was always quite fond of.
Yeah, a lot of us here today are painters, and Whistler's use of white is something that's tremendously interesting to us. And not only that he used it, but what white paints he might have used, because Chinese white is very, very different from zinc white. But it's never included in the labeling.
Well, actually, Chinese white is zinc white. They're the same thing.
Chinese white is like Kleenex. It's a trade name. Chinese white was a copyrighted trade name.
In modern terms, you can buy a Chinese white, which is a watercolor, and a zinc white, which is a gouache. And the zinc white is much more opaque. So in modern terms, they're different.
Huh. I would have to look into what those two pigments are made of, because I wasn't familiar that there was a difference today between zinc white and Chinese white. Yeah. But back in that time period, Chinese white was zinc white.
Okay.
And it was sort of was a newer pigment and it was also was really called Chinese white initially by Winsor and Newton. They coined that term, and they basically said that they had refined the pigment in such a way that it was made it even better than zinc white. But really, it still was zinc white. Now, what Whistler used early on, though, was he was using lead white, which was a terrible watercolor pigment. It was made lead white was made as a watercolor paint early on, but then they found that it darkened, and that's when zinc white really came in and Chinese white and supplanted.
Yeah, that would be a very interesting thing, though, to include on your labeling.
On the labels upstairs, you mean? Oh,
yes.
We are. I have to tell you, we're very limited by the amount of information we can put on, and so it's a real struggle to get out all the information. Okay. Oh, and that's another reason why we're going to do this website, is to really get out. We've got so much more information to tell and give that the website's going to allow us to do that.
Oh, that'll be wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah.
To your point, though, there have been, and you even commented on how sap green was a different thing to two different color makers, and how white is a different thing to different color makers even today. This, I think, tremendously brave consortium of paper conservators got together in order to try to invent terminology that everyone can use that says the same thing. And so there is actually a website out there that has this terminology. And when we did the watercolor exhibition at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, we tried to use that lexicon, which is to say, on the label or in the caption of a photograph of a book, to say watercolor and opaque watercolor. In other words, even the term gouache can be very different to different, and since most objects we can't actually scrape off a tiny piece of the pigment and test it to see what's in it, all we can say is it's opaque watercolor. That's about the best you're going to get on a label, is what I'm saying to you who are seeking more information, because oftentimes it takes very fancy testing and testing that actually It might literally destroy the object to test it, to find out what it's made of. So we're never going to know what some of these pigments are. So all we can say is watercolor and opaque watercolor.
But the one interesting thing is that traditionally, like, opaque watercolor is thought to be the watercolor paint, but with white added to make it opaque. And what's so interesting about Whistler is that he added this zinc white in everywhere, and yet half of the watercolors he added it to are very transparent. So what do we call them? Do we call them opaque because they've got the white, or do we call them transparent because they're transparent? So it really gets tricky.
But it's a big issue with contemporary watercolor painters about whether or not opaque pigments are okay, like whether they're orthodox or unorthodox. And I've had many watercolor artists, especially who came to see the exhibition in Philadelphia, who were astonished by the amount of opaque watercolor that was going on. And all of your heroes, Sargent, Homer, the rest, they're all mixing white in.
That's the whole dirty little secret, is
Yeah.
that there was no actual pure British technique, right? They were all using white.
Yeah, but I mean, Ruskin himself, who was like the fountainhead of information about watercolor painting from the middle of the century with a famous handbook, he advocated mixing white into your aerial tints, into the clouds, into the sky, into the distant mountains, because he said just a little bit of that white makes it very soft and atmospheric, gives you a great sense of distance and of space between you and the far distance. So the idea that like opaque white was like a no-no, I mean, many artists were using opaque white.
I think we have time for one more question, if anybody has something on their mind.
If I may, a couple of random comments which you can respond to or not. In terms of female support and encouragement of watercolor, I would certainly look at Elizabeth Boot Duveneck, because she was certainly the motivation behind Duveneck establishing the school in Venice and attracting the students there. And it would be fabulous, and I think the resources have not been discovered, of Duveneck boys and watercolors by that group of followers. That would be fabulous to discover as a random...
You're assigned. You're assigned.
With your help. Another comment, there is absolute evidence that Whistler was begging the Duveneck boys for money in July of 1880 to sustain his existence. My thought being, he probably could not afford watercolor pigments in 1880 in Venice. Just a thought.
Well, he did have watercolors with him in Venice, or maybe he was borrowing them. We don't know. Is that what you think?
I definitely think there's a good chance he was borrowing from the Duveneck boys and all the people he was with in Venice, because we have
No, he was begging for money.
Well, for money as well, but I also think he may have been borrowing paints.
Well, and using Otto Bacher's printing press, so sure. My final thought is modernism. Proto-modernism. Lee, we actually need more investigation into that concept. His watercolors, the abstraction, the dissolution of form, is astounding. It's truly astounding. And right at 1900, you have people, Whistler, John White Alexander, Edward Steichen. There's this gray area that really needs to be explored about proto-modernism.
I couldn't agree more, Marianne, and I think that one of the things that's really made it so problematic to situate Whistler in this sort of normative narrative of modernism is the fact that so many of his works ended up here in the Freer Gallery of Art, where the context for understanding them was either kind of genteel tonalism that Kathy talked about, or a broader kind of multicultural narrative of beauty, where his work was seen as kind of the culmination of a cosmopolitan or global tradition of artistic practice. And so he was effectively removed from that discourse and really became I don't want to say that he was an anachronism, but he came to be seen as something of an anachronism because of kind of the institutional history of collecting his work. We're going to take one more question from Lee Glazer, and I want to say that when I announced her forthcoming program in September, I got the date wrong with Peter. Peter Ulrich and Lee Glazer will be doing the lecture and painting demonstration not on September 21st, but on September 22nd. So mark your calendars, and Lee, you get the last question.
Thank you. I just want to say we're so excited that you've done this show, and I've had the chance to get a sneak preview of the catalog, which has so many smart observations, and I was really excited to read it, so thank you. Is there, with Alfred Stieglitz promoting small-scale, intimate settings and works on paper, and clearly Marin and others, watercolors, and Georgia O'Keeffe's early watercolors, have we found, or has anyone found a very direct connection of anything that Stieglitz has said that is sort of connected to any interest or understanding of what Whistler had contributed? And
it's a really, that's a dissertation topic or a book topic for somebody because it's sort of untapped territory. I think in terms of what happens in America, say after 1909 or so, and where sort of the Whistler-Freer nexus fits into it, is Agnes Meyer is a connection, because she was kind of interacting with both Freer and with Stieglitz. I think that certainly Stieglitz, and even his early work in sort of a more pictorialist vein, is clearly derived from Whistler. But that link seems to get severed in the wake of the Armory show. And a different lineage develops. I don't know, I mean, what do you all have other thoughts about that?
Stieglitz showed Marin's etchings, and Marin's etchings are definitely the child of Whistler. I mean, so that story is powerful. He definitely showed works in all media. One of the things that Stieglitz always said as a kind of cornerstone of his gallery approach was that any medium can be expressive and powerful, that there is no hierarchy. It's not like oil painting is better than pastel or photography. I mean, photography was definitely in the mix. And so it was that kind of democratization of the media, which is, in a way, Whistler is a poster child for that, for working across media and from being very experimental. But I agree with you completely. It's a topic that needs to be mined a little bit deeper.
And even, I mean, when Martha Tedeschi did her big study of the Marin watercolors, she definitely, as a Whistler scholar, links Marin to Whistler, but in kind of the art historical literature, that connection isn't really emphasized. And I mean, I think that Brooklyn Museum exhibition of 1921 sort of set the stage for pushing Whistler off to the side as kind of an eccentric or vestige of the past century. So anyway, thank you all very much. Please go upstairs and enjoy the exhibition.
And